Hey there, Javalock here, and I'm actually really excited about today's conversation. So far on the channel, I've given you guys a little bit of extra knowledge, some tips, and just my general opinion on things related to Dungeons & Dragons. But this time, I'm going to give you guys something you can use to create something all your own. We're talking about how to build a one-shot. Now, you might be running your first session ever, or maybe you're looking for a more concrete way to build sessions in the future. Either way, I'm going to provide you with the tools and the tips I use to create one-shots. I keep mentioning that this topic is about creating one-shots, but the good thing about my method is that it's scalable, so you can actually use this to create more complex campaigns later on, or you can use it to fill up existing campaigns. And finally, I'm going to be using my own tools and tips alongside the conversation in order to show you an example on how I use them. I usually hate it when people give me a how-to without providing examples, so I'm not going to do the same to you. After following my method, you'll be able to create a one-shot of your own in only about an hour or two. Here are all the sections that we're going to be covering. First up is the materials. Second is the setup. Third is our outline. Fourth are scenes. Then our spices. And sixth is just putting it all together. Now the materials that I use are actually pretty bare bone. For the most part, you'll just need a journal to write your one-shot in. You'll need the monsters manual, or any kind of collection of stats for monsters. And then finally, just the player's handbook. Now, there are a lot of other useful tools out there, but these are just the essential ones you need. I love the Dungeon Master's Guide, but I wouldn't classify it as essential. Okay, now let's go to the setup. Here we're going to be crafting the basics of our one-shot. Whenever I first start crafting a one-shot, I like to create what is called a logline. Now, a logline is basically the one-shot summary or its intention. Loglines are a great way to enforce focus and cohesion into the session. And depending on the complexity of the session, I usually try to restrict my logline to 2 or 4 sentences. Really, all your logline needs are these 3 things. 1. The problem. 2. How the players are introduced to the problem. And 3. How the players hope to solve the problem. After I create my logline, I add to it while I develop the one-shot. Eventually, you'll break the sentence restriction. Here's my logline. At the behest of their guild, your party was recently assigned to settle a local dispute between 2 feuding families. This feud has escalated to new levels as Family A has kidnapped a member of Family B. Your task is to locate the kidnapped person and bring them home safely. Pretty simple. It introduces the problem, tells the players how they're involved, and describes what they need to do in order to solve the problem. And now we can start filling out the outline to our one-shot. Now, you don't need to do this, but I always like making a little graphic in my journal where I have point A and then just a line and then point B. Point A is the start of the session and point B is the end. Adapting this to our logline, A would be, at the behest of their guild, your party was recently assigned to settle a local dispute between 2 feuding families. B would be, locate the kidnapped person and bring them home safely. Pretty simple. That's our outline. Much like our logline, we can add to this as we continue to develop our one-shot. And this brings us to our next section, scenes. So I like to define scenes as moments where you, the DM, get a chance to place the players in a specific scenario. Your players will perform in these scenes, and there will be some sort of conclusion or consequence at the end of the scene. I classify these scenes into 4 basic categories: combat, social, treasure, and hazards. And as you develop more complex campaigns, you'll start to develop more complex scenes, and even scene subtypes. But these 4 scenes are the basic foundation in building campaigns. You can tell the main focus of these scenes based on their name, but it's important to remember that Dungeons & Dragons is a wild and unpredictable game. I like to classify these scenes by the way the situation will most likely be resolved. That is to say, when I plan a combat scene, it will most likely be resolved with combat. However, if your players find a way to resolve scenes another way, I think you should explore those options. Another point that I like to mention about building good scenes is that you always want to have some sort of functionality within the scenes. Never create a scene just to fill in time. Always have it mean something. And I'll go into that in more detail as we start talking about the scenes themselves. Okay, let's start defining these scenes. A combat scene. Now, what a combat scene is pretty straightforward. But trust me, you'll have a lot of room to make these scenes more dynamic and actually get some functionality out of these scenes. Basically, you place your players in a situation where the resolution of that situation will most likely be found in combat. You can initiate these scenes simply by starting combat. So for an example, if the players are traveling through a tunnel, a beast or a monster might try to attack them. Players are going to have a hard time reasoning with the beast and stopping the momentum of this fight. Players can also be placed in hostile situations that may not start in combat, but will easily lead to it. An example of such situation may be like a group of bandits trying to rob the players of their money. Players can decide whether or not to comply or fight back. And maybe the bandits attack regardless of their choice. But giving players decision-making options is a great way to immerse those players into the game. Maybe the players are even just at the wrong place at the wrong time, interrupting some other helpless NPC in the process of being mugged. Do they charge in and help that NPC, or do they avoid interaction? Something to think about when you're planning a combat scene is identifying the purpose of that scene. And the purpose of these scenes can be for both in-game and out-game reasons. A good out-game reason could be to see how players handle combat. How do they handle it against a single threat? What about a horde of threats? Do your players work well together? An in-game reason could be used to explain things like why the players were specifically assigned this task. Is what they're facing above their pay grade? You can even use this to further support the threat at hand. Maybe the foe they're facing is now a result of the actual quest. And even if you do want to throw in a fight just for the sake of combat, think about what it might mean for the players. Are you trying to burn their limited resources? Or are you really just trying to end the adventure at that moment? Answering these questions will greatly help when you're trying to plan out the type of combat scene you want to introduce. Now for our next scene, I call this a social scene. And social scenes are a bit similar to combat scenes in the fact that they're pretty straightforward. Here, the players get a chance to interact with an NPC or a group of NPCs in order to resolve this scene. However, social scenes generally have a deeper level of intent as opposed to the combat scenes we discussed earlier. And that is to say, the reasons why the players have been prompted to interact with this entity. Maybe the NPC the players are interacting with knows some valuable information on scenes to come. I like to use my social scenes to program some kind of influence in the game. The idea being that characters with prior knowledge of an event would reasonably approach the event in a different way. An example will be something like this. The players run across a wounded hiker. The hiker warns them that there are goblins ambushing travelers up ahead. How or why the hiker gives the players this information is up to role-playing. Maybe he responds if the players are kind to him. Maybe he asks to be escorted a small ways back. That's all up to you. The benefit of having this information is that now you as the DM have just introduced new elements into the one-shot. Maybe players now decide to take an alternative path. Maybe now they plan a way to turn the tables on the goblin ambushers. Social scenes can also be used to help aid in the hazard or treasure scenes in the same way. Knowing information prior can maybe help reduce the challenge rating of the events to come. Sometimes, social scenes don't really have a specific payoff. You can even use these scenes to further support the spices that we're going to be adding in later. Now, social scenes might require more role-playing, which might be a little daunting for players and DMs. I think it helps to remember that social scenes really play a supporting role for scenes to come or the game in general. For our one-shot example, we're going to have a group of guards patrolling the area. We'll start them off hostile to the party, but with the right amount of role-playing, the players can learn information that the guards know, like about an abandoned carriage up ahead. I'll also give the players a reduction in skill checks regarded to that carriage from, let's say, a DC 12 to a DC 10. On to the next scene. These are what I call treasure scenes, and as the name implies, these scenes will provide some sort of monetary reward to the players. I like to use treasure scenes to provide players with the means to utilize some of the other skills in Dungeons & Dragons. Resolving a treasure scene can require particular knowledge, such as a language like Draconic or maybe even the Thieves' Cant. It could also require knowledge of historical or deity information, meaning players will have to perform a history or religion check. Something I think that makes treasure scenes stand out above all the other scenes is that it's kind of the least required in a one-shot. And I say that because acquiring wealth in a one-shot is a pretty useless endeavor. Players aren't going to really have the opportunity to spend the money that they get. In a one-shot, treasure scenes are especially helpful when you supply your players with consumable items, like potions. You can even incorporate key items that may affect a part of the game later. These could be items like a key to an alternative route, or maybe even evidence to validate a particular truth. Treasure scenes can be used to gather information, add spices, and give players a moment to gather their thoughts and rest up. Again, these scenes are great for setting up future scenes. Now, for our one-shot example, we're going to place the abandoned wagon here. The abandoned wagon appears to be disabled and recently attacked by some sort of beast. Players can perform a perception or investigation check into the wagon, and with the skill check DC of 12, they'll find 2 potions of healing. And hazard scenes are the last kinds of scenes that I want to talk about. Hazard scenes can serve a wide range of purposes, but in general, they're just going to be used to either whittle down player resources or highlight key features of the environment. I like to use my hazard scenes to support some sort of physical challenge, so maybe the players have to cross a rickety bridge, or the players have to carefully navigate through a portion of a path. These scenes are great for exploring your players' decision-making skills. How exactly are they going to get across this hazard? I also like to leave the hazards with a wide range of ways to overcome them. I don't like just one simple solution. Of course, you can always make an obvious solution, but I think it really helps players when they have to think about the solution at hand and how they're going to resolve it. In our example, we're just gonna go with the classic rickety bridge. The players are trying to cross over a bridge with maybe rushing water, and players have to make a dexterity save, DC of 8, and if they don't, they fall off of the bridge and they enter the water themselves. And resolving this can be pretty simple. Players who make the save can cross the bridge with no kind of issues, but players who fail fall into the water and maybe get battered by the rocks in the stream, doing something like a random 1d6 of bludgeoning damage. You can even add further saves to kind of compound the consequences. So maybe once a player falls into the water, they have to make constant saves to get out. Okay, now that we have the basic outline for our one-shot and we understand what scenes are, it's time to introduce some spices into the plot. I call these spices because they add a whole level of complexity into the game playing experience. Now, while you can add spices into any part of the session, I like to use my spices to add some dynamic element into the session's conflict and its resolution. So first off, let me briefly define spices in terms of building our one-shot. The spices are used to provide players with their own opportunity to make decisions and assumptions during the course of the one-shot. Looking at our basic outline and structure, we can use these spices to introduce new information. That information will change the perspectives that the players have towards the situation. It'll also encourage players to respond to the situation in a way that's more reflective of their characters. In general, the right kind of spices will encourage players to think about which actions they're going to take and help with building immersion in the game. Further, I think spices add a lot of replayability amongst the one shot, in case you wanted to run it again with maybe different players. Now, going back to our outline, let's introduce a spice to point A. An important thing to remember is that you as the DM hold all the information. I like to call this the understory or the ground truth. Now, the ground truth is initially unknown to your players, but bits and pieces of it will be revealed as they go through the one shot. Now, writing your understory will help you create more effective scenes and more effective spices. So even though we're just getting to this point now, I actually like to write my understory after I finish my logline. Another point that's really important to remember is that your spices don't give a direct answer. They just further support information or help in decision making. Now, there are tons of ways to place spices into your one-shot, so I won't really be dedicating too much time into the spices themselves. But I will say, I like to use spices to do two things. Generally, I use them to either support or damage the understory. And second, I like to use them to highlight the differences or the relationships that the player characters have with one another. So, we know that my logline is this. At the behest of their guild, your party was recently assigned to settle a local dispute between two feuding families. This feud has escalated to new levels as Family A has kidnapped a member of Family B. Your task is to locate the kidnapped person and bring them home safely. Now, this is my understory. The youngest heir to Family A and B have actually fallen in love and they've decided to elope. This means that while the feud is the source of the conflict, neither family is directly responsible. While the lovers were traveling by carriage, they were attacked by a beast and injured. So they fled to a cave in the region in order to recover their strength and plan their next move. This is my new outline. It shows point A and point B, and it shows the order that I've placed each scene in. And now that I have my logline, my outline, and my understory, I'm gonna start adding my wrinkles in. So at point A, the beginning of our story, I'll add a member of family B who takes a character aside and offers a reward if they kill the culprit of family A and bring back the body. He can also insinuate that members of family A are generally bad people. At my first combat scene, I'll actually have the players fight a group of scouts from family A. These scouts are anxious and hot-headed and assume that the players have a hand in kidnapping the member of their family. Now this is important because it also supports the spice that I put at the start of the quest, and that is that people from family A are generally bad people. My new social scene will involve players coming across a merchant who's selling items as he travels. After a pleasant talk, he'll mention seeing a carriage that belongs to family A, and how the people that he talked to were quite pleased with the items that they purchased. And if the players want more information, that's when I'll make them really start role-playing. Now at the end of this social interaction, the merchant will tell the players the direction of the carriage and how he sold them weapons because there are beasts up ahead. And this point about mentioning beast further supports my understory. Our hazard scene will be taken directly from our example, involving a rushing river and a questionable rope bridge. Players can make all the decisions and risks that they need to in order to cross this hazard. If I wanted to add more definition to this scene, I can add something like a sign that shows a way to avoid the bridge, but would involve a longer route. And in this longer route, I might throw in an extra combat scene. My treasure scene will involve the players finally finding this carriage, only it's in shambles. There's evidence that it was recently attacked, and players who make the appropriate checks can find those 2 potions of health that we talked about in our example. Players can perform other checks like investigation or perception to find information that supports the idea that the carriage belonged to family A, or maybe they find a specific piece of item from the kidnapped person in family B. We can also add more spices here. Maybe the players find a ledger book that belongs to family A, and that ledger book links family A to other crimes or other nefarious acts. This further supports that information that we got at the very beginning, that people from family A are generally bad people. And the reason why we keep bringing this up is because we're introducing a bias that will affect how players interact with the game. It's gonna make a more dynamic role-playing experience. We'll also add a key item to the investigation here at our treasure scene. So what this item will be is a simple trail of blood, and this will give the players a logical way to find the kidnapped person, or who's ever alive after this assault on the carriage. And finally, we're introduced to our last combat scene. Here, players will find the beast that's responsible for attacking the carriage. And I'll use this combat scene to more or less act as a boss fight, giving the players a pretty hard challenge. At the end, the players can follow the blood trail and find the lovers hiding in a cave nearby. We finally find out that the kidnapped members are actually lovers, and they beg the players not to return them to their families. Now, whatever the players decide to do is ultimately up to them. Maybe they force the lovers to come back, dragging them if they have to. Or maybe they decide to have mercy on them and let them go. Really, it's up to what the players want to do and just how you kind of resolve that situation. Now, in terms of the ending, in a one-shot like this, I would usually just do some sort of quick summation. The players make it back to town, and there's room for player interaction and reaction, but we really just end this on an epilogue, briefly saying what happened after. And there you have it, we just created a one-shot. I went into a lot of detail on scenes and structure, But once you understand those, you'll be able to generate a one-shot in a very short amount of time. Further, these structures and definitions can be adapted to a wide range of other campaigns, and we'll talk about those in a later conversation. And yeah, that's really my method. I can't wait to hear the one-shots you guys come up with. So if you have any questions or comments, you know where to put them. And yeah, it would be great to see in the comments some of the log lines that you guys come up with. Alright, until we talk again, live with strength and function. And be safe. Peace out.